Blackman of the Nile and his family, Part 10. Petrie's comments above, as presented in antiquity, were typical of the white racism of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and such was the order of every branch of human behavior in Western civilization. Margaret A. Murray, writing in her own words, Ancient Egypt, London, 1916, page 115, detailed the entire hypotheses of Petrie, which she endorsed in its entirety. From these events, and many more which this writer has brought to your attention, one should be able to see and understand why the self-proclaimed authorities on Egypt and Nubia, all of whom are Europeans and European Americans, cannot be expected to have the confidence and endorsement or title or respectability on anything African by Africans and people of African origin anywhere. Of course, the language and or dialects used among the Nile Valley indigenous African people were common from the Nile most southern beginnings in central Alkebulan to its most northern endings at the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The proof is that they used the same common writing and language to communicate during their many periods of conquest and rule over each other's nations. These historical facts have been carefully edited out from white study courses, which everyone must learn, and in many cases have purposely surpassed by academians. For example, the titles of the pharaohs and queens of Ethiopia, Punt, Meroe, Cush, Tahanisi, Timeria were similar, and in many respects they were the same. The following are exact titles for both Ta-Nehisi and Timeri, wife of God, the widow of the deceased pharaoh, whom the current one succeeded, being the recipient of the said title from her husband's role as the god Osiris, which he became by virtue of his death and resurrection into the netherworld and deification with Osiris. In the following, we can see the second role that the queen played in her role as the wife of a particular pharaoh, mother of his children, daughter, and even sister. In this case, the pharaoh had to be alive, thus her title, Lady of Two Lands, the heiress, who became the great wife of the living pharaoh. Another example of the commonality of the Nile Valley indigenous languages and related dialects used by the Africans of the lower lands can be seen in the titles Queen, Hatshepsut, used in her marriages to her oldest brother, Thutmose II, and youngest brother, Thutmose III, and possibly her own son or stepson at various periods of her reign over Timeri during the 13th dynasty, 1555 through 1484 BCE. These factors were rapidly changed after various wars had ensued between the Nile Valley Africans. By the ending of the New Kingdom period, the 13th through the 30th dynasties, 1580 through 1050 BCE, the entire nation of Ta-Nehisi had become the colonial territory of Timeri, including all of the territory south of the Fourth Cataract. The development of superior military arms by the northerners of Timeri made the difference. The expansion of the north on the south, as was inevitable as the invasion of Quetta, North Alkebulan, by French military forces from France. The underlying reality was the threat of starvation on the part of northerners, Egyptians and French in either case. In the dynastic periods of the Timerians, their basic economic needs and natural resources, also their skilled artisans, etc., came from Ta-Nehisi to the south. The same type of situation equally held true for the Europeans of France to the north, Europe of Quetta, Africa, as the French, who had nothing to resemble the abundance of the natural resources that Africans of Quetta to their south appeared to have enjoyed, which was very much more than the indigenous Africans needed for their own economic requirements. The invasion of the Southerners by the Northerners was not from the standpoint of anything called predestination. In each case, it was due to the practical geopolitics of governments and the economic realities that bred wars down through the centuries of man's inhumanity to man. In either case, the invaded Southerners were looted of their natural resources, their women raped, their god or gods and temples of worship sacrilegiously abused, and they found themselves colonially occupied to protect the constant flow of their produce to the homeland of the Northerners. Along with their natural resources, their professionals and technicians were carried off to the north to build new metropolis, which later on stole many more of their unskilled workers for cheap labor, and ever so often said market developed into full-fledged slave labor situations exclusively. Was this not the case of the Taimarians and the Ta-Nehisians, just as it were with the Greeks and the Romans, British and European Americans of the South and North of the United States of America, Germans and French, Carthaginians or Carthaginians and Romans, Africans and Moors and Liberians? This author sees it both ways with respect to the history of those two nations of Akubalan, Taimari, Egypt, and Ta-Nehisi, Nubia. In the ending, this very brief introduction to some of the chronologies of Ta-Nehisi, Taimari, Ethiopia, Kush and Meroe, and Punt, and other nations of the Nile Valley and Great Lakes regions of Akubalan, one needs to point out that there are recordings of countless events of a historical nature that took place between the invading Asians, the so-called High School Semites, of the 14th through 27th dynasties, 1675 through 1600 BCE, found at what once was considered all the way down south point at Luxor, Thebes, originally part of Nubia. They refer to the tyrannical treatment of the Taimarians under Pharaoh Kamos, the last pharaoh of the 27th dynasty, 1600 through 1555 BCE, during the period in which the northerners of Taimari were appealing to the southerners of Ta-Nehisi, Meroe, Kush, and Ethiopia, the last three nations located below the southern boundaries of the Fourth Cataract at this period of the appeal to assist them in their last battle against the High Coast tyrants. The historical fact is equally highlighted in M. Hammond's Chronicles of Egypt, 1955, pages 198 through 208, and A. H. Gardner's The Defeat of the High Coast by Kamos, the Carnavation Tablet number 1. Later findings including inscriptions on a rock at Toski, which show that Pharaoh Kamos' successor, Pharaoh Ames, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, 1555 through 1340 BCE, was planning an invasion of the southern lands beyond the Fourth Cataract, which did not take place. The latest aspect of Taimari and Ta-Nehisi's military encounters can be best appreciated in an article by F. L. Griffin, Oxford, Excavations of Nubia. What we have or should have observed is at least one main point in our safari into these chronologies with respect to the boundaries between Taimari and Ta-Nehisi is there was none in the true sense of the term usage in the international parlance of the 20th century CE, for it was not until Pharaoh Thutmose I of the 28th dynasty, 1350 through 1550 BCE, the successor of Pharaoh Amenhotep, 1557 through 1530 BCE, who was the real conqueror of the northern section of Ta-Nehisi, that any reference had been noted on a rock inscription at Tangor in Batin el-Hagar, which he done in the second Nile year of his glorious reign near the Third Cataract, another inscription of a granite boulder at a place called Thumbis provides us with a reference to Pharaoh Thutmose' naval engagement at the Dongola reach of the Fertile Lands northern beginning in Kush. The Dongola research inscription, as shown on the following page in hieroglyph, is the very first of its kind, with a little stretch of the imagination that be said to have been a boundary mark or line in the truest sense of the usage of the term in modern parlance. Nevertheless, the white liberal and orthodox authorities of Africa, particularly Mary and Ta-Nehisi, have invented many more of their Negro-less North and East Africa. In the final analysis, it is that the African or African Americans and African Caribbeans writers who must do his or her research into the background of the hundreds of thousands of inscriptions on papyri, stone fragments, walls of tombs and templates and other structures, in order that the pattern of the racist and religiously bigoted interpretations of said inscriptions can be edited out of future textbooks on Africa and African peoples everywhere. The textbook in question specifically to the racist hypotheses of Caucasian, Semitic, and or Hamitic North and East Africa, where there was never a Negro, Nigger, Bantu, Black African, African South of the Sahara, Forest Negro, until they were brought there as slaves for the Egyptians. Of course, such textbooks writers have conveniently overlooked the writings of Herodotus, Eusebius, Polybus, Julius Africanus, Terence Affair, St. Augustine, Josephus, and thousands more, all of whom refer to the African of Egypt, originally Mary, Kemet, Sais, etc., and other Nile Valley nations. Thick lips, broad nose, woolly hair, burnt skin. But if the educators of the African origin should write their own interpretations of their own history and heritage, using their own African authorities as the sole point of reference, then and only then will one see that the self-appointed European and European American liberal and orthodox authorities on Africa and African people for the racist and religious bigot most of them are. Thus, their racism and religiously bigotry can still be hastily removed with the respectability of academic scholarship, an honor which they have notoriously co-opted due to the negligence of African and African American educators, writers, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and whatever else there may be. Yet this writer is quite clear that the fact that the same self-appointed authorities on black people are the ones who for the most part control most of the funds which are necessary for grants that would make works of the type of black African or African American and African Caribbean interpretations necessary and meaningful. But there is no excuse of any worth which will continue to ponder the defeatist attitude that black people, sons and daughters of Mother Africa, cannot produce their own documentary history of their own past glory and heritage, as they do their own misfortune, which of course include the bestial slave trade initiated by the Right Reverend Bishop Bartolome de las Casas of the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1503 through 1506. Any such type of the defeatist attitude has for too long smothered the brain cells of the black communities of the United States of America particularly. All of this being especially true in the sacred halls of the Negro Church, and as such it is tolerated an indigenous African of Mary, Egypt, named Moses, to take honor for his wrongdoings in violating law and order in his own country in his own commission of murder against a fellow indigenous African. But African American Negroes and blacks berate the protector of said laws, included that which say no to African thousands of years before the birth of Abraham, the first Hebrew or Jew, you shall not kill, taken from the negative confessions that preceded Abraham and Moses by thousands of years. Pharaoh Ramses II, because most African Americans are not aware of the fact that Moses, as Ramses II and themselves, was an African, nor that the book of Exodus, drama dealing with the Jewish Passover, is an African story of people who had been in Africa for at least 400 years as slaves, according to the biblical text, and if they were in fact slaves for the Africans of Egypt. The people Herodotus and others described in their works what happened to their women. Did they not suffer the same fate as the African women in the United States of America when the slave masters was desirous of raping them sexually? No, not in the mind of those who are made to believe that North and East Africa, Egypt particularly, was never inhabited by anyone that looked like them, the so-called Negro. This is the same reason they do not know anything about the following inscriptions, all of which were supposed to have been cemented. The above inscription depicts the dethroned king Menerat, or Sarkhan IV, and other princes of Timeri as slaves in submission and bearing tribute to the Lion of the South, Tahanisi, Meroe, Cush, Ethiopia, and Punt. It was erected in the 21st Nile year of Pharaoh Pianki's reign, 730 BCE, and found near the great temple of Amun-Ra, 1862 CE, presently housed in the Cairo Museum, Cairo, Egypt, North Africa, the United Arab Republic. Today, the colossal figures erected in front of this temple was in excess of the greatness of those erected by Pharaoh Ramses II, the 19th dynasty, 1298 through 1232 BCE, of Abu Simbel, both of them in Ta-Nehisi, and of the craftsmanship of the south. Boundary lines shown on this map are reflections of the facts stated in the chronologies and historical data just presented. They also relate to the conflicting presentation by the self-appointed authorities on Africa with respect to the alleged racial differences between the Egyptians and Nubians we read so much about, all of which were supposed to have developed as a direct result of the physical and geographical barriers, Egypt at the north and Nubia at the south. This map is followed by others that relate to both Nubia and Egypt, along with Meroe, Ethiopia, Cush, and Punt, as they relate to the unitary high culture civilizations that fragmented into various high cultures beginning with the turn of the Second Dynasty period, 2980 BCE, and culminated with the Sixth Dynasty period, 2258 BCE. The student, as well as the general reader, should re-examine the text in conjunction with the topography of this map. The great colossal statue of the temple of Abu Simbel in Ta-Nehisi, or Nubia, modern Sudan, bear witness to the glory that was the high culture of the land to the south of Timeri. It was in this land that the ancient Africans of high culture at the end of the lower Nile Valley found their glorious beginnings. Here in Ta-Nehisi, the colossal stones were cut out and carved out of the marble, granite, and dorite quarries. All of this was completed hundreds upon hundreds of years before the arrival of the first European conquerors, the Macedonian Greeks under Alexander II the Great, the general Sotar. It was scenes such as this that made the earliest of the Greeks come to Timeri, and all of the other high cultures of the lower Nile included to learn architect, engineering, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, philosophy, astrology, numerology, agriculture, and all of the other disciplines they engaged in from and after their first student, Homer, graduated in the teachings of the Nile Valley indigenous Africans mystery system that was centered in the Assyrica at Luxor, Thebes today. They were Africans whose descendants are now called Negroes and Bantus. Note that the highly specialized type of architecture in the above ruins of the Temple of the Grand Lodge of Luxor, Thebes, and those designed much earlier by Imhotep, the architect of Pharaoh Dozier in the Third Dynasty, 2780 through 2680 BCE. It is also noted that the Greeks copied their mushroom and fluted columns from these Nile Valley African structures they observed when they came to the mystery systems to be taught by the indigenous Africans, who are now being called Semites, Hamites, Caucasians, and Nilotes. Showing the inscribed marble dream stela of Pharaoh Thutmose IV and marble altar in foreground, note that its face was blown away asunder by General Napoleon Bonaparte's officers' cannon fire practice 1798 CE because the general disapproved of its African Negroid facial characteristics. See on the spot drawing of this colossal statue by Baron Vivian Denon on page 111 of this chapter. Baron Denon accompanied Bonaparte and French military forces in their attempt at colonizing all of Northeast Africa. They were defeated by the British. During this period in history, the empire of Timurid Egypt extended as far as east as the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as far north as Colchis and Hellas, Pharos or Greece, as far west as Libya, and as far south as the gates of Ethiopia. The sphere of influence generated by the indigenous Africans of Timurid and other Nile Valley nations' conquest of these Asian and European lands also created reverse cultural carryovers on the Nile Valley high cultures. Yet this period followed another in which the armies of the Africans of the North and East Africa also entered Persia, Iran, and India, all the way to the Ganges River, as stated elsewhere in the text. You will note that Ta-Nehisi, Nubia, and Meroe are shown as part of the empire of Timurid, but one must not lose the sight of the fact that the indigenous Africans from all of the Nile Valley high cultures became pharaohs of the same empire during the same period. The student must relate this historical period to the various chapters in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, or the Old Testament, in order to separate allegory from actual facts. The scene above is from a painting in Tomb 63 of Timurid, Egypt. Like many others on the wall, it shows Syrian subjects and tribute bearers bringing quiver, vessels, ointment, and other material goods for the African pharaoh. Note one of the gifts is a little child, probably a Semite. The wall painting above would be designed one of Negro slaves from Nubia paying tribute to their Egyptian ruler, if the people were Nubians. Since the people are designated Semitic, the nomenclature slaves does not apply. Why is this so? The answer, racism and religious bigotry. The above personalities of Timurid and Ta-Nehisi are generally shown in their Greco-Roman versions and not as they appear. It is to be noted that there are numerous of these and others which have been painted and sculptured in various periods to suit the artist and sculptor's projection of the ruling group. The indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley made their personalities to have their own physical appearance. The foreigners from Asia and Europe made them in their own image, thus the reason for the vast differences in each period of time. This chapter would not have been complete without the author citing certain basic chronological data of Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and Greek religious history, all of which had their origin in the teachings of the Osirika of the Grand Lodges and religious societies of the indigenous Africans of the continent of Africa. There are many calculations in the following information of which the reader is about to be introduced. They may be quite difficult to understand in the case of the average reader or freshman student who has never before had any background in the higher degrees of the mysteries, such as the Oddfellows, Freemasons, Mechanics, Knights of Columbus, Royal Order of Elks, and other secret orders, commonly in practice throughout the so-called Western world, Great Britain, Europe, European American, and Caribbean islands, all having been patterned after the teachings of what they learned at the Grand Lodge of Luxor, Thebes. Said teachings, which included philosophy and religion, are revealed somewhat in the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Papyrus of Ani, pyramid texts, coffin texts, negative confessions, and a host of other works left by the ancient indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley, high cultures in their temples and tombs. Also on the walls, columns, ceilings, and floors of other structures they built. These were only a few of the teachings of the fellow craftsmen, many of whom descendants are so-called Negroes, Bantus, Africans south of the Sahara, Pygmies, etc., are borrowed from European and European American versions of what is left of the mystery systems their ancestors created and developed thousands of years before the origin of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek mythology. The secrets we are about to examine were introduced by the indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley and Great Lake regions of Africa thousands of Nile years before the birth and establishment of the Asian and European nations known as Sumer, Persia, Babylon, Palestine, and Rome, much less before the advent of what is called Western civilization, made up of nations whose people are today called Anglo-Saxon Caucasians, Indo-European Aryans, Semites, and even Hamites. These calculations arose from the teachings that even predated the alleged creation of the world by the Herebu, Jewish God Jehovah or Yahweh, by thousands of years, and equally many thousands more before the birth of Moses, another mythical Nile Valley African of the Herebu Holy Bible, the Torah or 5 books of Moses, and his invention, the first man, Adam, for his Garden of Eden somewhere along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers of southern Asia. Of course, all of this happened before the unearthing of the oldest known fossil man in the entire world, Zanjanthropus boys of Central East Africa. The numerology involved in the building of numerous temples, pyramids, colossal statues, dams, canals, stelas, measurements from Earth to other planets and stars, cosmology, astrology, various branches of science, medicine, philosophy, etc., along the entire Nile of the Blue Nile and White Nile valleys, also the Great Lakes regions down to the tip of Monomotapa, southern Akubalan, formed such of the basic formulas and other calculations employed in the following data to be presented, due mostly to the complexity of the mathematics of this ancient science created and developed by the indigenous Africans in the lodges of Osirica that maintained its major or prime seat of learning at Luxor. Luxor, the Holy of Holies, that was originally part of Ta-Nehisi, Nubia or Zeti, before the second dynasty, is the same center of major learning mentioned here. But it is entirely impossible to make the calculations any clearer than they are shown in this very much condensed and simplified introduction to the numerology of the lunar, solar, now tropical Cyarctis, and Solish year calendar system for calculating time periods of the pre-Christian and Christian era. The discrimination applied in the section of data, personalities, and historical periods involved are, of course, subject to quite a lot of constructive and destructive criticism, as many members of various disciplines related to this one probably would have preferred that other materials and sources of their own choosing would have been used. However, any other methods of selection would have been made impossible at this time, being that the nature of the overall text of this volume had to be complemented in this chapter. Yet, a much more extensive and detailed treatment of the ancient Nile Valley numerology and mathematical system with respect to the Nile Valley mysteries systems Osirica has been entered into by the authors of 7 volumes work being edited at present for possible publication in the very near future, a work of more than 28 years of research and preparation titled Africa in History, a Chronology, 1,750,000 years BCE through 1971, containing at least 4,000 pages with countless maps, graphs, charts, and pictures. Now we enter into the mathematical calculations developed by the indigenous Africans of the Great Nile Valley, many of which form the basis of the works attributed to certain mythological Greeks, most of whom there are no records of their birth, life, or death.